Welcome to NCBA's Cattleman's Call podcast with host Lane Nordland.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Cattleman's Call podcast. Lane Nordland, happy to be with you here today. And our conversation is coming from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., during the 2024 Legislative Conference. And joining us here today is Kim Brackett. She is the Policy Division Chair for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and an Idaho cattlewoman. And Mr. Ethan Lane joining us, Vice President of Government Affairs for NCBA out here in the Washington, D.C. office. But I guess, how is it going so far here with our LegCon, as we call it?
300 plus cattle producers on the rooftop at NCBA's DC office. No standing room left. Smoke coming off at least 3 grills. The chairman of the Ag Committee, multiple members of Congress, lots of producers from all over the country. It does not get any better in Washington than LegCon week, especially with high attendance numbers, enthusiastic producers, and a time in Washington when, good, bad, or otherwise, literally anything is possible minute by minute.
Definitely. And I know anything could happen during this. When we're talking, you could be called to the hill, so we want to make sure to get through our talking points here today. And Kim, for yourself, this is your first LegCon as a Policy Division Chair. What's it been like so far this year?
Oh, it has been great this year. Just the level of energy that I think our members have brought to Legislative Conference this year. I don't know if we've hit record attendance, but I feel like there's people, more people here than I've seen in the past. When we go into these offices, I think we're so well received, and our members are well prepared to deliver the messaging that we've talked about all week. So it's been very successful.
As the chair of the policy division. You're a face familiar to so many, though, in the cattle industry and in leadership and in Idaho. Let's just take this as an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience members here on the Cattleman's Call. Talk about your family's operation in Idaho and what it's been like serving in a leadership role, representing not only Idaho, but now cattle producers from across the nation.
Oh, sure. So my husband and I, our ranch is in southern Idaho. So we're on the Idaho-Nevada border. We're cow-calf producers. We summer our cattle on the mountain in Nevada and winter on the high country desert in Idaho. We are currently raising the 6th generation to be on my husband's ranch, my husband's family ranch there. As far as leadership experience, I have spent quite a few years working in different capacities throughout NCBA over the years. Really excited to be policy chair, really excited to connect with other producers across the country, work with other leaders to help further the goals of NCBA this year. It's going to be a great year. I know it's a little interesting times in D.C., to say the least, but really excited to go ahead and accomplish what we possibly can.
Now, we talk a lot about how NCBA is a policy-driven organization. Grassroots policy makes up that policy book. But maybe sometimes we gloss over that maybe sometimes because we're so used to talking about the issues in the policy book. So what are the responsibilities of the policy chair, and how do you work with other members of the board and NCBA leadership, but also the members out in the countryside and being a voice for them and being the policy chair?
Well, most importantly, being sure that we're representing the policy that's developed by our membership, that it's approved by our membership, making sure that everything we're doing, especially here in D.C., lines up with the policy that are approved at general membership meeting at convention every year. I think that's my number one responsibility. 2, definitely being involved with all of those executive committee members and committee leadership on the policy side of NCBA, making sure that getting feedback from them, making sure that providing them with the information that they need to carry out their job as well. And then finally, connecting with as many members across the country as we can at every segment of the industry. Attending those meetings throughout the year, hearing from them what's going on in their states that might be a little different than, say, in Idaho, for example, but really making sure to be that conduit between grassroots in the states and up to NCBA.
Well, thanks for giving a quick bio on yourself, and congratulations on the chairmanship as well. And we're out here to talk about that policy, to advocate on the Hill with these elected officials and agencies as well. And Ethan, earlier this year, we caught up with Colin Woodall, CEO of NCBA, discuss kind of what we were looking at for the upcoming 2024 year. And we've seen some changes just in the cattle markets and whatnot, and just how folks are doing out in the countryside. So from your position leading the Washington, D.C. office, can you share a little bit of a D.C. update for our friends?
Yeah, since the beginning of the year, now we're in April, 4 months into to 2024, 6.5 months into fiscal 2024 here for the federal government. Congress has been able to, in those 4 months since the beginning of the year and since the last time you talked to Colin, passed a funding bill for the year we are halfway through. That is the list, Lane, for this Congress in the last 4 months. I wish it was longer, but it has been a really contentious environment back here. You have one seat majorities for the Republicans in the House and for the Democrats in the Senate. Inside those majorities, you have fairly destructive partisan infighting happening amongst both parties, more publicly on the Republican side. That tends to be the focus, right, of the House leadership and kind of their struggles. So we're all watching that in stereo. Democrats have exactly the same problems. They're just able to hide them a little better when they're in the minority. But it has proven to be a real challenge, regardless of the speaker, regardless of the issue. You have, the folks in the Freedom Caucus that have kind of come to be known as the Hell No Caucus, right? Even if it's something that they introduced, they generally will still vote against themselves on some of those pieces of legislation, which is always amusing to watch. They can never quite explain why, other than, it kind of feels good to do that, and Facebook likes it, and, they kind of get these sort of groups on social media and elsewhere that respond to that. But it has left a lot of legislators really frustrated. We've watched a lot of early departures. We're seeing another one here in the last week with Mike Gallagher leaving, another productive sort of moderate Republican voice that basically said, I'm done. Ken Buck said the same thing a month or so back from Colorado. So it is it's a difficult environment to advance anything. Here we are in kind of overtime already on the Farm Bill. We're expecting a draft here in the next few weeks from Chairman G.T. Thompson. I've been consistent in saying that is a stretch to imagine that being passed. A $1.5 trillion, ag and nutrition bill in this environment is extremely unlikely. So we're kind of looking at some of the stuff that's being debated right now: Israel, Iran, Ukraine, border security. These are the issues that base voters are wanting to know more about, wanting to hear about, wanting to see some action on. Once they get past those, good, bad, or otherwise, it's going to be kind of full campaign season. And so that's kind of the playing field that we're looking at. We're focused on fiscal 25. They're going to have to do something with that before the end of September. But yeah, it's a good year to keep your powder dry and kind of look at the horizon, because this is not a productive Congress.
What did I read the other day when President Truman made the comment about a do-nothing Congress back there in the 1940s, and they had passed several thousand pieces of legislation, and then you compare that to what has actually gone through with this one. So it's actually pretty comical, because when comparing that to now, but at the end of the day, NCBA is still out here being a voice for the members out in the countryside. And Kim, for yourself, being a producer in Idaho, traveling across the nation and talking with producers, we're concerned. We're concerned about the future, passing on our ranch to the next generation, first generation folks trying to be successful, making a go of it, high input costs. What's some of the feedback or concerns you're hearing from cattlemen and women out in the countryside, and what you're doing to encourage them to maybe have their voices heard through that policymaking process?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the most common theme of what I hear from folks out in the country is the increasing government overreach. It just feels like every little pocket of our country is being impacted by tremendous regulations coming down from D.C. I think more so in this administration than it's felt like in more recent administrations. Incredibly frustrating there. I also hear a lot about the misperception about the cattle industry in the sustainability conversation. When you look at that broader sustainability conversation, and there's so much confusion amongst consumers, amongst DC decision makers about exactly what the facts are when it comes to the cattle industry. I hear a lot of frustration about that as well. And then, I'm from Idaho, so I hear a lot about predators. There's a lot of discussion about wolves. We're talking grizzlies. That's definitely a hot topic. But as far as what I do to try to encourage them, I really encourage them to engage with their state cattle associations, engage with NCBA. It's so incredibly overwhelming to try to do any of this on your own, right? All by myself. I have no power. I can't do anything. But if we all join together at a state level, at a national level, we can finally move the needle. We have so much more impact and possibility for improvement if we're able to all work together.
Now, you mentioned grizzly bears. I come from just across the border there in Montana, and this is an apex predator that we know is recovered in the lower 48. I just received a text from a former Montana stock growers officer, and they just had a probable confirmed grizz kill in central Montana, a long ways away from the Rocky Mountain front, a half mile from his house. I was about an hour and 20 minutes south of his ranch, fencing on my in-laws' place where we run cattle, and the whole time I'm just like kind of looking around because we have a lot of black bears, but you don't know when that grizzly is going to be coming through because they haven't been there in a long time. There's a lot of concern with that. And now we see the plan to introduce grizzly bears into that northern Cascades ecosystem in Washington state. And I'm careful with my words because it's not a reintroduction, it's an introduction.
Correct.
What has that been like from the policy side in advocating for these producers and their concern, looking at what we're going through in Montana with an apex predator that's on the ESA?
From a policy professional's perspective and somebody from this industry, it's incredibly frustrating to be lectured to in this town constantly about the need to focus on impacted stakeholders, right? The need to focus on those that can't advocate for themselves. And yet when we get into debates like airdropping all of these apex predators into the North Cascades, or refusing to acknowledge the recovered status of grizzly bears or gray wolves, right? Or refusing to acknowledge the growth of the 10J experimental Mexican gray population down in my neck of the woods in Arizona. The common theme there is zero interest or regard for those individuals that have to actually live with these animals, while the voice of the urban condo dweller reigns supreme, right? Because 3 million of them comment, right? And talk about how iconic. Well, they're watching it on a Hulu documentary, which is radically different than seeing them at the tree line while you're out working on your property. So it's an incredibly personal issue, I think, for our ranchers. It's an incredibly personal issue for us here in the DC office. We try to drill those points home as often as we can. And, you have kind of a two-stage problem. The Endangered Species Act is irreparably broken. We know now 3 different administrations, ours and both, have tried to delist the gray wolf. And they have demonstrated through that it is impossible to remove a species because they are recovered if there is any type of emotional connection to that species amongst Americans that don't have an actual vested interest in the issue. So we have a major problem to deal with there at a statutory level with the Endangered Species Act. And we also have a PR battle because those individuals that are not impacted have shown time and time again they do not care that this is a problem for our producers, for rural communities. They don't care that our children are at a bus station or a bus stop waiting for the school bus and are under threat because of that. They aren't interested. They are interested in that emotional connection they have to that animal. It is a major hill for us to climb. We kind of take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I think we'll see that again as we move forward. There's different strategies of delisting distinct populations. We've now learned over the last few years at the Supreme Court that's not an effective strategy as long as you're considering the entire range of these species. And the environmental community and the animal rights community are going to continue looking for these soft targets. They're going to continue looking for these opportunities to quite literally inject illness into a rural community by depositing an apex predator that wasn't there before onto that landscape. So it's a battle that I've been fighting for now 15 years in Washington. My wife as well in her career here. It's something we talk about at the dinner table, usually with gritted teeth. But yeah, it's frustrating.
And also frustrating for producers. Just this last week, the Biden administration announced rule changes to the ESA, 3 distinct areas, reverting back from changes made by the Trump administration, dealing with economic impacts, habitat, even if that species isn't even there. And I'm drawing a blank on the third one.
Those are the big ones.
Yeah.
It's all of the changes we made from a regulatory perspective to ESA. We collectively, the royal we, during the Trump administration, right? Because you have the statutory landscape, which is very difficult to change. And then you have the regulatory landscape, which is really high tide, low tide as administrations change. The Trump administration did a lot of really good work on things like that. If we pile enough dirt on this coffee table, the case can be made under the Endangered Species Act as it was written in the Obama administration that habitat has the potential to support a species. And because the potential is there, that's definitely critical habitat. Well, I think we can all agree sitting in this room, this coffee table should not be critical habitat for anything, right? That's really what we're talking about. On the economic side, there is a long-held belief in the environmental community that you have to consider these species without the burden of considering economic impact, right? Because it'll cloud your judgment if you let dirty money get involved. Well, we need to make sure people can eat and clothe themselves and keep the power on as well. So these were pretty rational changes, and the Biden administration is hoping no one notices how irrational it is to roll them back as they kind of rush to get this stuff done before the Congressional Review Act deadline, which is rapidly approaching. And that's sort of the end of an administration, potential for a change in party power. There are some rules that can be used to roll back administration regulations from previous administrations. We used it to get rid of BLM Planning 2.0 at the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration. There's a red line copy of that hanging down the hall in my office. And it's a tool that everyone is eyeing now. And because of that, we're going to continue to see the Biden administration pump this hot garbage out the door in the next few months, trying to get as much out there as possible before that deadline hits.
Now, you mentioned the BLM, and it's very new news that just came out right before we started this podcast, and that deals with the BLM landscape conservation landscape health rule, or BLM rule that we were calling it over the summer. Every meeting we went to throughout the summer and fall, that was the big talking point. It got pretty quiet. I know Public Lands Council and NCBA were keeping the pulse on the situation, but some of that information just came out ahead of Earth Day when the Biden administration's BLM wants to push that out. Ethan, I know the text literally just came out, but what was in that text? What is NCBA concerned with? But maybe what are some areas where the concern from the countryside was felt in that rulemaking process?
So if you zoom out for just a second to the BLM Planning 2.0 rule we were just talking about, that was the BLM career staff's effort last go-round to figure out how to stop having to make grazing decisions and oil and gas decisions, right? Because they have a mandate to manage for multiple use and sustained yield. If they make a decision that is counter to that, they expose themselves. But they want, some of them, not all of them, you can't paint, a broad brush. They want the ability to say no more often. So they need different tools to be able to just put some of these lands into what they believe is, conservation use. I would argue if you don't have cattle grazing on those landscapes and sheep grazing on those landscapes, you're not conserving them. And I think our members would agree with that. But this is a long-standing effort. We killed it in BLM Planning 2.0. They have now come back with this landscape conservation rule, which basically elevates or attempts to elevate conservation to a permitted use. That gives those career bureaucrats the ability to make a grazing decision and say, we're choosing conservation instead. And in doing so, they would no longer be at odds with their mandate to manage for multiple use and sustained yield, right? You choose recreation, choose oil and gas extraction, choose mining, choose grazing, choose a combination of those things, choose timber, or choose conservation. And so, you can see this long-term strategy to shift the real management objectives of BLM through plans like this. We are just literally like over text message in the middle of multiple meetings looking at what we've got here in this final rule. It looks like they've stepped away from some of the big issues we had concerns with. nothing is ever perfect, and the devil's always in the details. So we're digging in now. My phone is literally running out of batteries as new text messages come rolling through on what we're finding. But it does look like we've seen them retreat from some of what was in that proposed rule. We will obviously be out on the street as quickly as possible with all of the detail. By the time this podcast airs, our listeners should have that information in their hand, and either hear me light my hair on fire or thanking them for listening to reason on some of this, and Caitlin Glover with the PLC as well. But yeah, it looks like we were able to make some ground up there, but we'll see what all we were able to pick up.
And, we talk about public lands, and Kim, for your family and so many other families across the western United States, the viability of our family ranches depends on that short period every year where we get to help play that conservation role of, management, of our public lands and grazing. It's essential. How important is it for you as a leader in NCBA to share the message of ranchers who graze on public lands and share that with other ranchers out in the landscape that maybe don't understand the complexity of what it's like to have those public lands?
That's a great question. I grew up on my parents' ranch in Wyoming, and it was all private lands. They were in just this little area where there was no public around. So when I got married and moved to Idaho, I was like, what on earth? It blew my mind. So pretty steep learning curve for me. I do sometimes wonder about our members who do run on only private lands, because I think they probably get really tired of hearing about all the problems we face on public lands. But if you look at how many times we're litigated on public lands, the environmental groups know that if they can make inroads on public lands, then they can roll that out to private lands down the road. So it is important. I think it oftentimes is a precursor for what's coming across the country. Sharing with those NCBA membership, the battles that we're fighting on ESA especially, and being able to maybe develop a roadmap to address some of those issues that the environmental groups are throwing at us, whatever it might be, I think is really important. I cannot wait to read the conservation role. I wish I'd known. I would have asked for 5 minutes to go through that. I can't wait to see. But I think the other part about the public lands is it really gives us an opportunity to speak with our decision makers here in DC about what we are doing as public lands managers that's considered conservation, right? They are not mutually exclusive. Grazing is not mutually exclusive from conservation. So having an opportunity through NCBA to visit with those decision makers about what my production practices are that would fall under that category and helping them see that, I think is really important part of what we're doing here this week.
Another big topic that really, for many ranchers, just came out of the blue and had them shaking their head, Ethan, was the Securities Exchange Commission and their greenhouse gas emissions rule. Most producers be like, what, where's this coming from? But obviously, we saw a big win for the agriculture industry in the SEC greenhouse gas emissions rule. Talk about what that final result was and the work and the input that came in from the countryside on that.
Yeah, this was something that our members really engaged aggressively on. This is something that our state affiliates and here at NCBA and in other parts of agriculture, everyone had their alarms going full blast on this one. The Securities and Exchange Commission remaking themselves into an environmental agency. We already have the EPA. I assure you that's plenty. Adding the SEC into the mix and putting on their sort of, deputy environmental manager hat and asking entire supply chains requiring emissions through those supply chains, that may be, a discussion point in a supply chain where you're manufacturing buttons, and you kind of have a handle on that. In the U.S. cattle and beef supply chain, that's an absolutely insane request to make, right? To go down to the cow-calf level, Scope 3 emissions reporting as part of that for publicly traded companies. It's just unworkable. It's unreasonable. At a certain point, Gary Gensler, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, started to get the message that this was really a poor idea. He started going to the Hill and saying, no, we're going to protect farmers. You've got it all wrong. We didn't mean to include them at all. And our feedback at that point was, appreciate the sentiment, but the rule still reads in a way that gives us a lot of concern. The final rule did exempt agriculture from that Scope 3 reporting, which is a huge win. It's important for our listeners, though, to remember that the rest of the world, you go to Europe and have this conversation, you go to the United Kingdom and have this conversation, farmers are all already talking about Scope 3 emissions reporting. So we need to remember that we beat this one back today. This issue is not going away. As long as ESG and boardroom activism is a continued threat, not just to us, but to anybody in any of these regulated industries, we are going to continue having conversations like this, and we're going to need to stay vigilant.
Again, a lot of priorities, a lot of policy creation that will appear over the next year, whether it's on that front or issues that producers are seeing in the countryside. And Kim, from your perspective, I guess, what are you looking forward to most as policy chair?
Oh, most? That's a really hard question. I'm looking forward to a lot. I'm really looking forward to meeting new members across the country, engaging with them, visiting them in their home states, learning about what's important in each of those states, what's important issues for them. I'm really excited to work with such a strong leadership team here at NCBA, both our volunteer leaders and our staff as well. I'm really, really excited. I have already engaged in several areas that I think we're moving the needle a little bit, so loving that. And also looking forward to maybe broadening our coalition a little bit. I think there are folks out there who are in our corner, but maybe not necessarily involved in the cattle industry, yet they're vested in our success, right? They need us and they want us to be successful. So reaching out to them and maybe building a few bridges, relationship building in that area as well.
Sometimes it's easy to complain online about what's going on, and a lot of people just put their thoughts out online and don't really follow through or see how they can solve a problem. So I guess from both of your perspectives, how can producers out there have a say in what's going on? How can they get involved in policy creation and taking those concerns that they may have down at the cafe or the stockyards or at the kitchen table? What are some words of encouragement on how they can take those concerns and help create policy and have a voice out in Capitol Hill? Kim, I'll start with you.
I think it's so important that they understand that they can engage at a state level, right? They can start attending those meetings. They can get involved, whether it's committee work at a state level, if you want to step onto your state boards, and learning how to go through the commenting process, for example, on this conservation rule, on the SEC rule, that's really important, starting at that state level, and then never overlooking the importance of NCBA, what we're doing broader. It might not be as specific to your individual ranch, but that broader industry perspective is absolutely critical. So talk to somebody, go to our website, see how you can sign up, become a member, get engaged, and be involved.
Ethan?
Yeah, it couldn't be more important at this point to follow your advice, right? To follow Kim's advice. Set down the iPad, set down the anonymous Twitter handle, get up from the coffee shop, go to a county cattlemen's meeting, go to a state cattlemen's meeting. Put your voice on the record. Put your money where your mouth is and be part of the solution. We have to have that debate, right? If everyone who doesn't agree stays home and you just have 200 people in the room that are all nodding in unison on an issue, we have made zero progress. We need that discussion. NCBA nationally is a big, broad, diverse group of producers, and the view from their ranch gates does not look the same at all. It is our biggest strength and our biggest liability all at the same time. It's what makes us great. So the only way that continues to flourish is if you show up and really engage. You don't sit in the back of the room, look down at your boots. You have to get involved. And that starts, as Kim said, right in your backyard. There are meetings happening everywhere. And the first step is to step away from the iPad and actually join the conversation.
Well, I know you both have to run a busy day here in D.C., but thank you for taking a few minutes with us to talk about policy and what's going on out here in Washington, D.C. and out in Idaho. Did you get snow yesterday? Did you hear? We had snow in Montana yesterday when I was flying out here. So
we had snow last weekend. My kids were rodeoing in a blizzard, it felt like. Pretty exciting.
It's springtime in the West.
Absolutely.
You never know. But thank you both for joining us here today, and for our friends joining us. If this is your first time listening to the Cattleman's Call podcast, make sure and subscribe, share it, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or watch some of our podcast conversations. Also have a video component, but we are so excited to have you join us here today, answering the Cattleman's Call. I'm Lane Nordlund. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to NCBA's Cattleman's Call podcast with Lane Nordlund. For more information, visit ncba.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast today.